Lonely rancher found a mute girl locked in a cage. She gave him a note saying, "Bury me far from Dad." The Wyoming wind cut through Samuel McKenna's weathered coat like a blade as he urged his horse forward across the desolate prairie. At 52, his face bore the deep lines of a man who'd spent 3 decades fighting the elements, rustlers, and his own demons. The autumn of 1883 had been particularly brutal. Cattle thieves had made off with nearly 40 head of his best breeding stock, and the trail had led him to this godforsaken stretch of land where civilization seemed to have forgotten to take root. His bay geldings snorted nervously as they approached the skeletal remains of what had once been a homestead. The roof had partially collapsed and the walls leaned at precarious angles, as if the very earth was trying to reclaim the structure. Samuel had heard whispers about this place in town, the Hartwell property, abandoned after some kind of tragedy that folks preferred not to discuss. The kind of stories that made people cross themselves and hurry past when the subject arose. "Easy, boy," Samuel murmured, patting his horse's neck. The animal's ears were pinned back, nostrils flaring at something Samuel couldn't yet detect. Years of ranching had taught him to trust his horse's instincts, and right now, every fiber of the animal's being screamed danger. The tracks he'd been following, the distinctive hoofprints of his stolen cattle, led directly to a ramshackle barn behind the main house. The structure looked ready to collapse under the weight of its own neglect, but the ground around it was disturbed, marked with fresh wagon ruts and boot prints. Samuel dismounted, his spurs jingling softly in the eerie silence that seemed to blanket the entire property. As he approached the barn, a sound made him freeze. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably human, a soft whimpering that raised the hair on the back of his neck. Samuel's hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 on his hip as he crept closer to the source of the sound. The barn door hung askew on rusted hinges, and Samuel eased it open with the barrel of his drawn pistol. The interior was shrouded in shadows, but shafts of afternoon sunlight pierced through gaps in the weathered boards, illuminating a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his days. In the far corner, barely visible in the dim light, was a cage. Not the kind used for animals. This was cruder, more sinister. Rough-hewn wooden bars lashed together with rope and wire, just large enough for a person to crouch inside but too small to stand or lie down comfortably. And within that cage, huddled in filthy rags that might once have been a dress, was a young woman. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s, with tangled auburn hair that fell like a curtain around her gaunt face. Her green eyes, wide with terror, fixed on him as he approached. She pressed herself against the far side of the cage, her body trembling like a wounded animal. "Jesus Christ," Samuel whispered, holstering his weapon and rushing forward. "What in God's name?" The woman's mouth opened as if to scream, but no sound emerged. She clawed at her throat, frustration and fear warring in her expression. Samuel knelt beside the cage, noting the crude lock that secured it. A simple mechanism that had clearly been fashioned by someone with more malice than skill. "It's all right," he said softly, the way he might speak to a spooked horse. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name's Samuel McKenna. I'm going to get you out of here." The woman's eyes darted to his face, searching for some sign of deception. Samuel could see the intelligence there, despite her obvious trauma. This wasn't just some unfortunate soul who'd lost her way. This was someone who'd been deliberately imprisoned, deliberately broken. He examined the lock more closely. It was secured with a thick iron key, but the metal was old and corroded. Samuel drew his knife and worked at the mechanism, his weathered hands surprisingly gentle despite their size. After several tense minutes, the lock gave way with a satisfying click. The cage door swung open, but the woman didn't move. She remained huddled in the corner, watching Samuel with the wariness of a creature that had learned to expect pain from human hands. Samuel backed away, giving her space. "Take your time," he said quietly. "Nobody's going to hurt you now." Slowly, painfully, the woman began to unfold herself from the cramped confines of the cage. Samuel could see that her legs were weak, unsteady from what must have been weeks or months of confinement. Her dress, if it could still be called that, was torn and stained, hanging from her emaciated frame like a burial shroud. When she finally stood, swaying slightly, Samuel realized she was taller than he'd expected, probably about 5.5 feet when she wasn't hunched over in terror. But it was her eyes that struck him most. Intelligent, defiant, and filled with a pain so deep it seemed to have no bottom. She opened her mouth again, trying to speak, but only a hoarse whisper emerged. Frustrated, she looked around the barn until her gaze settled on a piece of charcoal near an old forge. Moving with sudden purpose, she snatched it up and began scratching letters on the wooden wall of the barn. Samuel watched, his heart pounding, as words began to form under her desperate scrawling. "Bury me far from Dad." The charcoal broke in her trembling fingers, but the message was clear. Samuel stared at the words, feeling a cold dread settle in his stomach. This wasn't just a case of someone being held prisoner. This was something far more sinister. Something that spoke of family betrayal and unspeakable cruelty. The woman collapsed to her knees, her strength finally giving out. Samuel moved forward instinctively, catching her before she could hit the ground. She was frighteningly light, all sharp angles and jutting bones beneath the tattered fabric of her dress. "We need to get you to a doctor," Samuel said, but the woman shook her head violently. She grabbed his wrist with surprising strength and pointed toward the barn door, then made a slashing motion across her throat. The message was clear. Leaving meant death. Samuel looked back at the crude cage, then at the woman in his arms. Whoever had done this to her was still out there, still a threat. But he couldn't leave her here, couldn't abandon her to whatever fate awaited her return. "My ranch," he said quietly. "It's about 10 miles north of here. You'll be safe there." The woman's eyes searched his face again, looking for the lie she'd learned to expect. But Samuel McKenna had never been a man given to deception. What she saw in his weathered features, the lines of integrity carved by years of honest work, the steady gaze of a man who'd faced down wolves and outlaws with equal courage, seemed to satisfy her. She nodded once, a small gesture that carried the weight of absolute trust. As Samuel helped her to her feet and guided her toward his horse, he couldn't shake the image of those words scratched into the barn wall. "Bury me far from Dad." Whatever this woman had endured, whoever had caged her like an animal, the reckoning was coming. And Samuel McKenna, despite his preference for solitude, found himself unwilling to let her face it alone. The ride back to Samuel's ranch tested every ounce of his patience and horsemanship. The woman, who he'd taken to calling Grace in his mind, though she'd given him no name, sat in front of him on the saddle, her body rigid with terror every time they encountered other riders on the trail. Twice she'd grabbed his arm so tightly her nails drew blood, her eyes scanning the horizon for threats only she could see. Samuel's ranch, the Circle M, sprawled across a valley that had taken him 20 years to tame. The main house was modest but solid, built to withstand Wyoming's brutal winters and the occasional band of rustlers who thought a lone rancher made for easy pickings. As they approached the weathered wooden structure, Grace's grip on his arm loosened slightly, though her vigilance never wavered. "Martha," Samuel called out as he dismounted. His housekeeper, a stern woman in her 60s who'd been with him since his wife's death 8 years prior, emerged from the kitchen wiping her hands on her apron. Martha Hendricks had seen her share of hardship. Widowed young, she'd raised 3 children alone before coming to work for Samuel. But even she wasn't prepared for the sight of the broken woman Samuel carefully lifted from his horse. "Sweet Mother of God," Martha whispered, crossing herself. "What happened to her?" "Found her locked in a cage out at the old Hartwell place," Samuel said grimly. "She can't speak or won't, but she's been through hell." Martha's weathered face hardened with the righteous anger of a woman who'd spent her life protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. "Bring her inside. I'll heat some water for a bath and see what I can do about those clothes." Grace shrank back as Martha approached, but the older woman's movements were slow and deliberate, her voice gentle as she spoke. "There now, child. Nobody's going to hurt you here. This is a safe place." The next few hours passed in a blur of careful ministrations. Martha had seen to Grace's immediate needs: a hot bath, clean clothes, and a bowl of broth that the young woman could barely manage to swallow. Samuel had watched from a distance, noting how Grace's eyes never stopped moving, constantly assessing threats and escape routes even as she accepted their help. It was near midnight when Samuel found Grace sitting by the window in the guest room, staring out at the moonlit prairie. She'd managed to communicate through gestures and crude drawings that she couldn't sleep, that the darkness brought memories too terrible to face alone. "Mind if I sit?" Samuel asked, gesturing to a chair near the window. Grace studied him for a long moment before nodding. They sat in comfortable silence watching the stars wheel overhead. Finally, Samuel spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I lost my wife 8 years ago. Sarah. She died in childbirth. Her and the baby both. Grace turned to look at him, her green eyes reflecting the moonlight. For the longest time I thought I was done with caring about people. Figured it hurt too much when you lost them. Samuel's weathered hands gripped the arms of his chair. But sitting here now seeing what someone did to you, it reminds me why we fight. Why we keep going. Grace reached over and touched his hand briefly. The first time she'd initiated contact with anyone since her rescue. In that simple gesture, Samuel felt the weight of her trust, fragile as spun glass, but real nonetheless. The next morning brought visitors. Samuel was in the barn tending to his horses when he heard the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. Through the barn door, he saw 5 riders approaching at a hard gallop, their faces grim with purpose. The man in the lead was someone Samuel recognized, Cyrus Hartwell, a brutal giant of a man with dead eyes and a reputation for violence that stretched from Montana to Colorado. McKenna, Hartwell bellowed as he reined in his horse. I know you got something in mind. Samuel emerged from the barn, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Cyrus. Can't say I was expecting company. Hartwell's eyes were bloodshot, his face flushed with drink and rage. Don't play games with me, McKenna. I know you were sniffing around my property yesterday. You took something that don't belong to you. Only thing I took was some stolen cattle that had my brand on them. Samuel replied evenly. Unless you're calling me a liar. One of Hartwell's men, a weasel-faced killer named Pike, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. We ain't talking about cattle, and you know it. Where is she? Samuel's blood ran cold, but his expression remained neutral. She? My daughter, Hartwell snarled. That worthless piece of trash ran off again, and I got witnesses saying you rode away from my place with something on your horse. The word daughter hit Samuel like a physical blow. Grace's desperate message suddenly made horrifying sense. Bury me far from Dad. This monster, this creature who wore the face of a man, had caged his own child like an animal. I don't know what you're talking about, Samuel said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. But I think you and your boys should move along. You're not welcome here. Hartwell's face contorted with fury. You're making a mistake, McKenna. A big one. That girl belongs to me, and I'll have her back one way or another. The only mistake here is you thinking you can ride onto my land and make threats, Samuel replied. Now get off my property before I decide to make this a permanent inconvenience for you. For a moment, the 2 men stared at each other across the dusty yard. Hartwell's hand hovered near his gun, but he was outnumbered by the reality of Samuel's reputation. The rancher had been a Texas Ranger before settling in Wyoming, and his skill with a gun was legendary in these parts. This ain't over, McKenna, Hartwell spat. I'll be back, and next time I won't be so polite. As the 5 riders thundered away, Samuel felt a presence behind him. Grace stood in the doorway of the house, her face white with terror. She'd heard everything, understood that her sanctuary was temporary at best. She ran to the barn and emerged with a piece of charcoal frantically scrawling on the side of the house. He'll kill us all. Samuel gently took the charcoal from her trembling fingers. No, he said firmly. He won't. I won't let him. Grace shook her head desperately, pointing toward the horizon where Hartwell's dust cloud was still visible. She made a gesture across her throat, then pointed to Samuel, then to Martha, then to herself. You're trying to protect us, Samuel realized. You think if you go back to him, he'll leave us alone. Grace nodded, tears streaming down her face. She began walking toward the barn, clearly intending to saddle a horse and ride back to her father. Samuel caught her arm gently but firmly. Grace, that's what I'm calling you, Grace. You listen to me. I've been fighting men like your father my whole life. I know his type. He won't stop with just taking you back. He'll come for Martha and me anyway because we've seen what he is. Grace's eyes widened with understanding and fresh terror. Our only chance is to stand together, Samuel continued. You, me, Martha, we're family now, and family protects each other. For the first time since her rescue, Grace's rigid posture softened. She leaned against Samuel's shoulder, her body shaking with silent sobs. In that moment, Samuel made a promise to himself and to the broken woman in his arms. Cyrus Hartwell would never touch her again, even if it meant war. 3 days passed in uneasy quiet. Samuel had sent word to Sheriff Bolton in town, but the lawman's response had been predictably unhelpful. Without witnesses or proof of wrongdoing, there was little he could do about Cyrus Hartwell's family matter. The law, it seemed, had little interest in protecting a woman from her own father, especially when that father owned half the county and had judges in his pocket. Grace had begun to communicate more freely through her writing, though her voice remained locked away behind whatever trauma had stolen it. She'd written her real name, Elena Hartwell, on a piece of paper, along with fragments of her story that painted a picture of unspeakable cruelty. Her father had locked her away when she'd tried to escape his control, when she'd refused to marry the brutal man he'd chosen for her, a man who would expand Hartwell's criminal empire through blood and intimidation. Martha had taken to Elena like a mother hen, teaching her to cook and mend, treating her with the gentle kindness the young woman had never known. Samuel watched their interactions with a mixture of joy and heartbreak, seeing how Elena slowly began to trust, to smile, to show glimpses of the person she might have been if not for her father's cruelty. But the peace was shattered on the fourth morning, when Samuel's foreman, old Pete Garrison, came thundering into the yard with news that made Samuel's blood run cold. "Boss, you need to see this," Pete gasped, his weathered face pale with shock. "Found it nailed to the gatepost this morning." The paper he handed Samuel bore a message written in Cyrus Hartwell's crude scrawl. "McKenna, you got until sunset to return my property or I burn you out. The girl comes willing or I take her over your dead body. Choose quick." Elena saw the paper and immediately grabbed Samuel's arm, her eyes wide with terror. She snatched the charcoal from her pocket and wrote frantically on the side of the barn, "Let me go. Save yourself." Samuel crumpled the threatening note in his fist. "I told you before, Elena. We stand together or we fall apart. I'm not letting him have you." But even as he spoke the words, Samuel knew they were facing impossible odds. Hartwell had at least a dozen men, all killers and cutthroats who'd follow him into hell for the right price. Samuel had Pete, who was pushing 70, and had arthritis in his gun hand, and Martha, who could shoot, but was no match for hardened criminals. As the sun climbed higher, casting short shadows across the ranch yard, Samuel made his preparations. He cleaned his rifles, loaded his pistols, and positioned ammunition around the house. Martha had barricaded herself in the root cellar with Elena, despite the young woman's protests. "You listen to me," Samuel had told Elena firmly. "If something happens to me, you take one of the horses and ride north to the Clayton Ranch. Tom Clayton's a good man, he'll see you safe." Elena had shaken her head violently, tears streaming down her face. She'd written, "No," on a piece of paper so hard the charcoal had broken, then thrown her arms around Samuel's neck in a desperate embrace. The sun was still high when the dust cloud appeared on the horizon. Samuel counted at least 15 riders, more than he'd expected. Hartwell had called in favors, brought in hired guns from as far away as Denver. This wasn't just about retrieving his daughter. This was about making an example, showing the territory what happened to people who crossed Cyrus Hartwell. Samuel positioned himself on the porch, his Winchester across his knees, his Colt .45 loaded and ready. The riders approached slowly, spreading out in a wide arc around the house. Samuel recognized several faces: Pike, the weasel-faced killer; Thompson, a cold-blooded murderer with a bounty on his head in 3 states; and Hartwell himself, sitting his horse like a king surveying his domain. "McKenna," Hartwell's voice carried across the yard. "I see you made your choice. Where's my daughter?" "Safe," Samuel called back, "and she's staying that way." Hartwell's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "You got spine, I'll give you that. But you're outnumbered and outgunned. Send her out now, and maybe I'll let you live." "Counter offer," Samuel replied, his voice steady despite the odds. "You and your boys ride out now, and maybe I won't kill you where you sit." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Samuel could feel the weight of 15 pairs of eyes on him, could sense the killer's calculating angles and distances. His finger found the trigger of his Winchester, and he said a silent prayer for Martha and Elena. Then, from behind him, came a sound that froze everyone in place. "Stop!" The voice was barely more than a whisper, hoarse and broken, but unmistakably real. Samuel turned to see Elena standing in the doorway, her green eyes blazing with determination. "Elena," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. My name is Elena, and I am not your property. Hartwell's face contorted with rage. You little... I remember everything, Elena continued, stepping onto the porch beside Samuel. Every beating, every night locked in that cage, every time you sold me to your friends for their entertainment. Samuel's jaw clenched at her words, but he kept his rifle trained on Hartwell. You broke my voice, Elena said, her words carrying across the yard like bullets. But you couldn't break my spirit. I found people who care about me, who protect me. I found a family. She reached into her dress and pulled out a folded paper. I wrote everything down, every crime, every name, every detail. Sheriff Bolton has a copy, Judge Morrison has a copy, and if anything happens to me or these people, copies go to the territorial marshal in Denver. Hartwell's face went white. You're bluffing. Try me, Elena said simply. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Pike, the weasel-faced gunman, made his play. His hand dropped to his gun, but Samuel's Winchester barked first. Pike toppled from his horse, his weapon never clearing leather. The yard erupted in gunfire. Samuel dove behind the porch railing, pulling Elena with him as bullets splintered the wood around them. Through the chaos, he saw Hartwell spurring his horse toward the house, his face twisted with murderous rage. Samuel's next shot took down another gunman, but there were too many. A bullet creased his shoulder, spinning him around. Another shattered the window behind him. Then, from the root cellar came the sharp crack of Martha's rifle. One of Hartwell's men screamed and fell. The old woman might have been a housekeeper, but she'd been a frontier wife first and she knew how to fight. The battle raged for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Samuel's ammunition was running low and he could see Hartwell's men closing in from multiple directions. This was it, the end of the line. But then, like thunder rolling across the prairie, came the sound of hoofbeats. A lot of hoofbeats. Sheriff Bolton rode into the yard at the head of a dozen deputies, their badges glinting in the afternoon sun. Behind them came Tom Clayton and his ranch hands, armed and ready for a fight. Drop your weapons, Bolton shouted. You're all under arrest. Hartwell's men, caught between Samuel's position and the arriving lawmen, began to surrender. But Hartwell himself wasn't finished. With a roar of rage, he charged his horse directly at Elena, his gun drawn. Samuel stepped into the path of the charging horse, his last bullet chambered. Time slowed as he raised his rifle, as Hartwell's gun swung toward Elena, as the distance between them closed to nothing. 2 shots rang out simultaneously. Samuel felt the bullet tear through his chest, spinning him around. But his own shot had found its mark. Hartwell tumbled from his horse, his gun flying from nerveless fingers. As Samuel fell to his knees, he saw Elena running toward him, her voice finally, fully returned as she screamed his name. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was her green eyes, no longer filled with fear but with something he'd never dared hope for. Love. The first thing Samuel heard when consciousness returned was the sound of gentle humming, a melody he didn't recognize but that somehow felt like home. His chest ached with every breath, and his left arm was bound tight against his body, but he was alive. More than that, he was warm, comfortable, and surrounded by the familiar sense of his own bedroom. Don't try to move just yet, Elena's voice said softly. Samuel's eyes fluttered open to find her sitting beside his bed, her auburn hair clean and braided, her green eyes bright with relief and something deeper. The doctor said you lost a lot of blood, but the bullet missed anything vital. How long? Samuel's voice came out as a croak. 3 weeks, Elena replied, reaching for a glass of water. Martha and I have been taking turns watching over you. She's downstairs making your favorite stew, said a man needs proper food to heal properly. Samuel struggled to sit up, and Elena helped him, her touch gentle but sure. Through the window, he could see the familiar expanse of his ranch, the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. Everything looked normal, peaceful, as if the violence of 3 weeks ago had been nothing more than a bad dream. Hartwell? He asked. Dead, Elena said simply. Your shot caught him in the heart. Sheriff Bolton said it was the cleanest case of self-defense he'd ever seen. She paused, her voice growing softer. The territorial marshal arrested 8 of his men. They're all heading to prison, probably for the rest of their lives. Samuel felt a weight lift from his shoulders. And you? Are you? I'm free, Elena said. And for the first time since he'd known her, she smiled. A real smile that transformed her entire face. Truly free. Hartwell's lawyers found a will he'd hidden away, one that named me as his sole heir. Turns out the man was worth more than anyone imagined. Samuel raised an eyebrow. You're rich? Elena laughed, and the sound was like music. I'm rich enough. Rich enough to buy the old Hartwell place and burn it to the ground. Rich enough to start over wherever I want. She grew serious again. But I don't want to start over somewhere else, Samuel. I want to start over here. With you. The words hung in the air between them. Samuel searched her face, looking for any sign of obligation or gratitude masquerading as something deeper. But what he saw there was genuine affection, freely given. Elena, he said carefully, you don't owe me anything. What I did because it was right, not because I expected. She silenced him by placing her fingers gently over his lips. I know exactly why you did it, and I know exactly why I'm here now. Not out of gratitude, not out of obligation, but because somewhere in that terrible place I found something I never thought I'd have. A home. Over the following days, as Samuel's strength returned, he learned how much had changed during his recovery. Elena had used her newfound wealth to purchase supplies for the ranch, to pay off Samuel's debts, and to hire additional hands to help with the work. But more than that, she'd used her influence to help other women in similar situations, providing safe houses, funding legal aid, and working with Sheriff Bolton to root out the network of criminals who'd enabled her father's cruelty. I can't bring back the years he stole from me, she told Samuel one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. But I can make sure other women don't lose theirs. Martha had embraced Elena like the daughter she'd never had, teaching her not just domestic skills, but the subtle arts of managing a ranch and the men who worked it. The old housekeeper had watched their growing relationship with knowing eyes and a satisfied smile. About time you found someone who could match your stubborn streak, she told Samuel with characteristic bluntness. That girl's got steel in her spine and fire in her heart. She'll keep you honest. As autumn deepened into winter, Samuel and Elena's relationship deepened as well. They talked for hours about their pasts, their dreams, their hopes for the future. Elena's voice, once stolen by trauma, had returned stronger than ever. She had opinions about everything from cattle breeding to politics, and she wasn't shy about expressing them. You know, Samuel said one snowy evening as they sat by the fire, when I first found you, I thought I was rescuing you. Elena looked up from the book she'd been reading. And now I think maybe you were rescuing me, Samuel replied. I'd been living, but I wasn't really alive. Just going through the motions, waiting for my time to run out. Elena set down her book and moved to sit beside him on the couch. We rescued each other, she said simply. That's what love is, isn't it? Two people choosing to be brave enough to need each other. Samuel turned to face her fully. Is that what this is? Love? Elena's green eyes sparkled with mischief. Well, I certainly hope so, because I've been planning our wedding for weeks now. Samuel laughed, the sound rich and genuine. Is that a proposal? More like a statement of fact, Elena replied, leaning against his shoulder. Martha's already started working on my dress, and Sheriff Bolton's agreed to perform the ceremony. The only question is whether you're going to make me ask you properly. Samuel tilted her chin up with his finger, looking into the eyes that had first captured his attention in that terrible barn. But now, instead of fear and pain, he saw strength, love, and a future he'd never dared imagine. Elena Hartwell, he said solemnly, will you marry me? Yes, she whispered, her voice carrying all the certainty of someone who'd finally found home. Yes, I will. They were married the following spring, in a ceremony that brought together neighbors from across the territory. Elena wore a simple white dress that Martha had sewn with tears of joy in her eyes. Samuel stood at the altar in his best suit, his weathered hands steady as he placed a simple gold ring on Elena's finger. Sheriff Bolton, serving as both officiant and witness, spoke about the power of love to heal old wounds and create new beginnings. But Samuel barely heard the words. He was too busy looking at his bride, marveling at the journey that had brought them together. As they exchanged vows, Elena's voice rang out clear and strong across the assembled crowd. She promised to love, honor, and cherish the man who'd given her back her voice, her freedom, and her future. Samuel promised to protect, support, and stand beside the woman who'd taught him to live again. When they kissed to seal their union, the crowd erupted in cheers. But Samuel and Elena only had eyes for each other, lost in the perfect moment of two souls finally finding their match. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Elena pulled Samuel aside. "I have something for you," she said, reaching into her dress to pull out a folded piece of paper. Samuel unfolded it carefully. It was the original note she'd written in charcoal on the barn wall, "Bury me far from Dad." But now there were new words written beneath it in her careful script. "But first, let me live." Samuel looked up at his wife, this remarkable woman who'd survived the unthinkable and chosen to embrace life with both hands. "Have I mentioned today that I love you, Mrs. McKenna?" Elena smiled, the expression transforming her face into something radiant. "Not in the last hour, Mr. McKenna, but I love you too, more than I ever thought possible." As the sun set over the Wyoming territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel and Elena McKenna stood together on the porch of their ranch house. The future stretched before them, full of possibilities and promise. Elena had found her voice. Samuel had found his purpose. And together they'd found something precious and rare, a love born from the ashes of tragedy, tempered by hardship and strengthened by the choice to face whatever came next side by side. The lonely rancher was lonely no more, and the woman who'd once begged to be buried far from her father had instead chosen to live, to love, and to build a new legacy that would honor not the cruelty of the past, but the hope of the future. In the distance, cattle lowed softly in the gathering dusk, and somewhere in the house, Martha was humming as she cleaned up from the wedding feast. It was the sound of home, of family, of a life worth living. And for Samuel and Elena McKenna, it was only the beginning. What did you think of Samuel and Elena's incredible journey from tragedy to triumph? This story of love, courage, and redemption in the Old West shows us that sometimes the most broken people can find the strength to heal each other. If this tale of the lonely rancher and the woman who found her voice again touched your heart, please let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this powerful story of survival and new beginnings. Don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed this Western tale, and make sure to subscribe for more compelling stories that celebrate the resilience of the human spirit. Your support helps us bring you these unforgettable narratives that remind us that love can triumph over even the darkest circumstances.